My name is Jake Martinez. I'm a factory worker from Detroit who survived the first 21 days when the world froze over. When Yellowstone erupted and ash blocked out the sun, temperatures dropped 50 degrees in 3 weeks. My wife Maria was dying from pneumonia. We had no power, no heat, and no choice but to run south through a country full of desperate people who would kill for a can of food. This is how we made it out alive. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from. In the comment section below, perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. June 15th, 2025 started like any other Tuesday at the Ford Rouge plant in Detroit. I was on the assembly line welding chassis frames. Same as I'd done for 3 years straight. The morning shift was running smooth, production numbers looking good, and I was thinking about what Maria and I might do for dinner that night. You know how it is when life feels normal, when you take for granted that tomorrow will be just like today. My grandfather always used to tell me that the weather would be what kills us all in the end, but I never really understood what he meant until that ash started falling like gray snow outside the factory windows. I remember Tommy Chun from the paint shop came running into our section around 10:30 that morning, his face white as a sheet and his hands shaking. Tommy was this quiet guy who kept to himself most of the time, so when he started yelling about Yellowstone exploding, we all figured he'd finally lost it. The guy was practically screaming about mushroom clouds and volcanoes, waving his phone around trying to show us some news footage. Most of the guys just laughed it off and went back to their stations. I mean, come on, Yellowstone exploding. That sounds like something out of a movie, right? But I noticed something that made my stomach drop. When I looked out those big factory windows, there was this fine gray dust coating everything outside. At first I thought it was just regular pollution, or maybe some kind of industrial accident nearby, but it kept getting thicker. My lunch break, you could barely see the parking lot through all that gray stuff floating in the air. That's when I started paying attention to what Tommy was saying about the news reports. The emergency protocols we practiced every month at the plant suddenly didn't seem so pointless anymore. You see, Ford had us run drills for all kinds of disasters because of our location near the river and all the chemical processing we did. We had procedures for chemical spills, power outages, even terrorist attacks. But nobody ever planned for the sky to turn gray and the temperature to start dropping in the middle of June. I found myself thinking about those drills and wondering if any of it would actually help us now. During my lunch break, I called Maria to check on her at the elementary school where she taught 4th grade. She told me the kids were asking about the gray stuff falling from the sky, and she didn't know what to tell them. The principal had sent a note home to parents saying it was just some kind of weather phenomenon and not to worry. But I could hear the concern in Maria's voice, even though she was trying to sound calm. She said the ash was coating the playground equipment, and the kids weren't allowed outside for recess. That's when I knew this wasn't just some minor thing that would blow over in a day or two. The drive home that afternoon was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The ash was falling so thick that I had to use my windshield wipers just to see the road. It wasn't like snow that melts when it hits the warm glass. This stuff just smeared around and made everything worse. The radio was going crazy with reports about the Yellowstone supervolcano erupting, and they kept using words like catastrophic and unprecedented. They were showing satellite images of an ash cloud bigger than Texas spreading across the whole western part of the country. I remember stopping at a red light and watching this old man trying to sweep the ash off his front porch. He'd sweep a section clean, and by the time he moved to the next part, the area he'd just cleaned was already covered again. There was something about watching him fight that losing battle that made the whole situation feel real for the first time. This wasn't going to be over in a few hours. This wasn't going to be over in a few days. When I got home, Maria was standing in our backyard trying to cover her vegetable garden with old bed sheets. She'd been working on that garden for 3 years, and it was her pride and joy. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs, all kinds of stuff that we'd eat fresh all summer long. But the ash was coating everything, and even I could see that those plants weren't going to make it. Maria was crying as she worked, not big dramatic sobs, but just quiet tears running down her face as she tried to save what she could. That evening, we sat in our living room with the news on, watching footage of the eruption over and over again. The reporters kept saying this was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history, and the ash cloud was going to spread across most of North America. They were talking about how volcanic ash can block sunlight and cause temperatures to drop, but they were still calling it a temporary situation. Temporary. That word kept coming up in every report, like saying it enough times would make it true. But I was starting to remember things my grandfather told me about the winter of 1978, when Detroit got hit with the worst blizzard in decades. He used to say that winter wasn't about the cold. It was about being prepared for when the lights go out and the heat stops working. He always kept emergency supplies in his basement: canned food, batteries, warm clothes, tools, all kinds of stuff that seemed paranoid to me when I was a kid. Now I was wishing I'd paid more attention to those stories. The second day, Wednesday, the temperature dropped from 78 degrees to 65, and the ash was getting thicker. Maria called in sick to work because she said the air quality was too bad for the kids to be in school. When I got to the plant, half the guys in my section didn't show up. The ones who did were all talking about what they'd heard on the news, and none of it was good. Production was already starting to slow down because some of our suppliers out west weren't shipping anymore. I spent my break that day walking around the plant, checking on the backup generators that we tested every month. Something about seeing those generators made me feel a little better, like at least we'd have power if the main grid went down. But then I started thinking about what would happen if the generators ran out of fuel, or if the ash got into the air intakes and clogged up the engines. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that all our emergency preparations were based on short-term problems, not something that might last for weeks or months. By Thursday, the ash was 6 inches deep on the ground, and you couldn't see the sun at all. The sky was just this uniform gray color, like being inside a giant dirty cloud. The temperature had dropped to 55 degrees, and Maria was walking around the house in a sweater in the middle of June. She'd started gathering extra blankets from the closets, just in case, she said. But I could see in her eyes that she was thinking the same thing I was thinking. This wasn't just in case anymore. The grocery stores were starting to get picked clean. People were buying up all the canned goods, batteries, flashlights, anything that might be useful if the power went out. But most folks were still acting like this was just a temporary inconvenience, like a big snowstorm that would pass in a week or two. I remember standing in line at the hardware store behind this guy who was buying a single bag of rock salt, talking on his phone about how he just needed to get through the weekend until things got back to normal. Normal. That's what everyone kept talking about, getting back to normal. But I was starting to think that normal might be gone forever. Thursday night, Maria made us hot soup for dinner, and we ate it sitting close together on the couch with extra blankets. She was developing this little cough that she said was just from breathing all the ash in the air. It wasn't anything serious, just a dry cough that would go away once the air cleared up. But every time she coughed, I thought about how my grandfather used to say that the little problems become big problems real fast when you're fighting for survival. By Friday, the 4th day, it was down to 48 degrees, and the ash was over a foot deep. The plant management called an emergency meeting and told us they were shutting down operations indefinitely. They couldn't get parts from their Western suppliers. The air quality was too dangerous for outdoor work, and they were worried about the structural integrity of the buildings under all that ash weight. When I saw my supervisor, this tough guy, who'd been working at Ford for 20 years, Standing there with tears in his eyes telling us to file for unemployment, I knew we were in real trouble. I drove home that day thinking about my grandfather's compass and winter gear down in our basement. Stuff I hadn't looked at in years, but somehow I knew I was going to need it soon. Maria was home when I got there, and she'd been listening to the radio reports about people starting to evacuate from the northern states. The government was setting up emergency shelters in the south, places where people could go to wait out the crisis. But they were calling it voluntary evacuation, like it was just an option people might want to consider. That night, the power started going out in rolling blackouts. Our electricity would be on for a few hours, then off for a few hours, then back on again. The utility company said they were having trouble with the ash getting into their equipment, and they were working around the clock to fix it. But I could hear in the spokesman's voice that they were fighting a losing battle, just like that old man trying to sweep his porch clean. I went down to the basement and found my grandfather's old compass, the one he'd carried in Korea. It was in a wooden box along with some topographic maps of Michigan and Ohio, and a journal where he'd written down all kinds of survival tips. Reading his handwriting by flashlight, I could almost hear his voice telling me about the importance of staying warm, finding shelter, and always having a way to navigate when the roads get bad. He'd written about how to read weather patterns, how to find water, how to make fire without matches. Things that seemed like old-fashioned knowledge when I was growing up, but now felt like the most important information in the world. Maria found me down there reading through his journal, and she didn't say anything about how I was being paranoid or overreacting. She just sat down next to me and started looking through the maps with me. That's when I knew she was thinking the same thing I was thinking. We couldn't stay in Detroit much longer. Saturday morning, the 5th day, I woke up to the sound of Maria coughing. It was still that dry cough she'd had for a couple days, but it seemed worse. She said she was just tired from all the stress and the bad air quality. When I opened the curtains, I could see actual snowflakes mixing in with the ash. Snow, in June, in Detroit. The temperature was down to 38 degrees. And the weather report said it was going to keep dropping. I spent that morning walking around our neighborhood, talking to people, trying to get a sense of what everyone was planning to do. Our neighbor Bob, who drove truck for a living, was loading up his pickup with supplies. Bob had been on the road for 30 years and knew every back road between Detroit and the Gulf Coast. He told me the highways were starting to get clogged with people trying to drive south, but he knew routes that would avoid all the traffic jams. Bob said he was planning to head out in the next day or two, and if we wanted to follow him, we'd be welcome to join up. Something about Bob's confidence made me feel a little better. Here was a guy who'd been driving through bad weather his whole career, and he seemed to think this was just another trip that needed careful planning. But when I asked him exactly where he was planning to go, he was kind of vague about it. He said he had family down south, and he knew places where we could wait out the worst of it. It wasn't like he was being secretive exactly, but he seemed to know more about the situation than he was letting on. That afternoon, I went to the gas station to fill up our car and buy some extra fuel containers. The lines were getting longer every day, and people were starting to get impatient. While I was waiting, I heard this guy behind me talking on his phone about how he'd tried to fly out of Detroit that morning, but the airport was closed because of the ash. He was saying something about how the ash was getting into the jet engines and making it too dangerous to fly. That's when it hit me that we really were trapped up here, and the only way out was going to be by car. The grocery stores were even more picked over than they'd been earlier in the week. Canned goods were almost gone, and there was no bread or milk left at all. People were buying things they never would have bought normally, like canned spinach and sardines, just because there wasn't anything else left. One managed to get some crackers, peanut butter, and bottled water, but I could see that if we waited much longer, there wouldn't be anything left to buy. Sunday morning, the 6th day, we woke up to 6 inches of snow on top of all the ash. The temperature was 32 degrees, and Maria was shivering even inside the house with the heat running. She was still coughing, and now she seemed tired all the time. She said she was just not sleeping well because of all the stress, but I was starting to worry that it might be more than that. The air quality had been terrible for almost a week now, and breathing all that ash couldn't be good for anyone. I spent the morning going through our basement, pulling out everything that might be useful for a long car trip. Sleeping bags, extra clothes, tools, first aid supplies, and my grandfather's compass. I also found some old road maps that showed all the back roads through Ohio and Kentucky. Looking at those maps, I started to understand what Bob meant about avoiding the highways. There were dozens of smaller roads that would take us south, and they probably wouldn't be as crowded as the interstates. That afternoon, the power went out and stayed out. No more rolling blackouts, just nothing. The utility company wasn't even bothering to make announcements anymore. I tried calling my sister in Florida to let her know we were okay, but the phone lines were down too. It felt like we were being cut off from the rest of the world, one connection at a time. Maria and I spent that evening sitting by the fireplace, talking about what we should do. We had enough food to last maybe another week if we were careful, but after that, we'd be in real trouble. The temperature was supposed to keep dropping, and even if the power came back on, there was no guarantee the heat would work. The house was already starting to feel cold, and it was only going to get worse. I told Maria about Bob's offer to guide us south, and she agreed that it seemed like our best option. Neither of us had ever driven that far before, and we didn't know the roads well enough to make it on our own. But Bob seemed confident that he could get us there safely, and right now confidence was something we really needed. We decided to talk to him the next morning about when he was planning to leave. That night, lying in bed listening to Maria's cough and the wind howling outside, I thought about my grandfather's stories about the winter of 1978. He used to say that the hardest part wasn't the cold or the snow. It was the moment when you realized that help wasn't coming and you were on your own. Looking at the snow falling outside our bedroom window in the middle of June, I knew we'd reached that moment. Nobody was coming to save us. Nobody was going to make this go away. If we were going to survive, we had to save ourselves. The next morning, Monday the 7th day, I woke up to the sound of silence. No humming from the refrigerator, no clicking from the furnace, no background noise from all the electrical devices that usually ran constantly. The power was completely out, and the house was getting cold fast. When I looked outside, the snow was over a foot deep, and it was still coming down. Maria was awake too, and she was coughing more than she had been the night before. I went next door to talk to Bob about his plans to leave. He was already loading his truck with supplies, and he said he wanted to get on the road by that afternoon. He'd been listening to a battery radio, and the reports were saying that the highways south were getting more crowded every hour. If we waited much longer, we might get stuck in traffic jams that could last for days. Bob said he knew back roads that would avoid most of the congestion, but we needed to move fast. Looking at our house, at the neighborhood where we'd lived for 5 years, I knew this was probably the last time we'd ever see it. The snow was already covering the windows on the first floor, and the weight of all that ash and snow was making some of the roofs in our area start to sag. Even if we came back in a few months, there might not be anything left to come back to. Maria and I spent the rest of the morning packing our car with everything we thought we might need. Clothes, food, water, tools, blankets, my grandfather's compass and maps, and a few things that we just couldn't leave behind. Photos of our families, Maria's grandmother's jewelry, my grandfather's journal. Things that wouldn't help us survive, but would help us remember who we were. As we were loading the car, I noticed that several other families in our neighborhood were doing the same thing. People who'd lived here for years, who'd never talked about leaving Detroit, were suddenly packing up their lives and preparing to drive south. It was like watching a whole community dissolve in the space of a few hours. Neighbors were saying goodbye to each other, exchanging phone numbers and addresses of relatives down south, making promises to stay in touch that we all knew might be impossible to keep. Bob came over around noon to tell us he was ready to leave. He'd talked to a few other families, and we were going to travel in a convoy of 4 cars. Safety in numbers, he said, and if one car broke down, the others could help. He seemed to know exactly what route we were going to take, and he'd even marked some places on his map where we could stop for gas or food. The confidence in his voice made me feel like maybe we actually had a chance of making it. But as we were getting ready to leave, I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. Bob was packing a lot more weapons than seemed necessary for a simple drive south. He had a shotgun, a rifle, and I saw him putting boxes of ammunition in his truck. When I asked him about it, he just said that desperate people do desperate things, and it was better to be prepared. That made sense, I guess, but something about the way he said it made me wonder if he was expecting more trouble than he was telling us about. The last thing I did before we left was go back into our basement and get my grandfather's compass. One more time. I wanted to make sure it was working properly, and I wanted to read through his journal again to see if there was anything else that might help us. As I was reading, I found a page where he'd written about the importance of trusting your instincts and not following someone else's plan if it doesn't feel right. He'd written that sometimes the person who seems most confident is the one you should trust the least. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to that advice. But at the time, with the snow getting deeper and the temperature dropping every hour, Bob seemed like our only hope of getting out of Detroit alive. Maria was getting sicker, and I was starting to panic about what would happen if we stayed in the house much longer. We needed to move, and Bob was offering to lead us to safety. As we pulled out of our driveway for the last time, following Bob's truck toward the back roads that would take us south, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw our house disappearing behind the falling snow. Maria was coughing again, and she seemed smaller somehow, like the cold was already starting to shrink her. I reached over and took her hand, and she squeezed mine back. We were leaving everything we'd ever known behind, trusting our lives to a man we barely knew, and heading into a world that was getting more dangerous every hour. Our convoy of 4 cars followed Bob's red pickup truck through the snow-covered streets of Detroit, leaving behind everything we'd ever known. The Johnson family was in the car behind us, with their 2 teenage kids who kept looking back at their neighborhood like they couldn't believe they were actually leaving. The Garcias were in the 3rd car, an older couple who'd lived on our street for 15 years. And bringing up the rear was the Kowalski family, with their baby daughter who was only 8 months old. All of us trusting Bob to lead us to safety, following him down roads we'd never traveled before. Bob had mapped out a route that would take us through the back roads of southern Michigan, avoiding the highways that were already clogged with evacuees. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, turning left and right at intersections without even looking at his map. When I asked him during one of our stops how he knew these roads so well, he just said he'd been driving truck for 30 years and had learned every shortcut between Detroit and the Gulf Coast. But something about his confidence made me uneasy. Nobody knows back roads that well unless they've been planning this route for a long time. The first few hours of driving were almost peaceful, if you could ignore the ash still falling from the gray sky and the temperature gauge in our car showing it was 28 degrees outside. We passed through small towns that looked like ghost towns, with most of the businesses closed and hardly any people on the streets. The few people we did see were either boarding up their windows or loading their own cars with supplies. It was like watching a whole region empty out in slow motion. Maria was quiet during those first hours, just staring out the window at the snow-covered farmland. Her cough was getting worse, and she kept pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, even though I had the heater running full blast. When I asked her how she was feeling, she just said she was tired from all the stress and the bad air. But I could see that she was getting weaker, and I was starting to worry about what would happen if she got really sick while we were on the way. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, we stopped at a gas station in a small town called Hillsdale. The station was still open, but the owner looked nervous when our convoy of 4 cars pulled up. He kept watching the road like he was expecting more trouble, and he asked Bob if we were planning to stay in town or just passing through. Bob assured him we were just passing through, but I noticed that he paid for his gas with cash and didn't give the owner any information about where we were headed. While we were stopped, I overheard Bob talking on a small radio that he kept in his truck. He was talking to someone about our progress, giving them our location, and saying something about being on schedule. When I asked him about it, he said he was just checking in with other truckers about road conditions ahead. But the conversation I heard didn't sound like it was about road conditions. It sounded like he was reporting to someone who was tracking our movement. The Johnson family was having car trouble at that gas station. Their engine was making strange noises, and the temperature gauge was running hot. Bob took a look under the hood and said they had a coolant leak that was getting worse. He told them they could try to nurse it along for a few more hours, but they'd need to get it fixed soon or risk having the engine seize up completely. I offered to take a look at it myself, since I'd been working on cars and factory equipment for years, but Bob said we didn't have time to stop for repairs. That's when I started paying attention to how Bob was making decisions for our group. He wasn't asking us what we wanted to do or discussing our options. He was just telling us what we were going to do, like we were employees, and he was the boss. When Mrs. Garcia asked about stopping to find a motel for the night, Bob said we needed to keep driving until we reached his planned stopping point. When the Kowalskis asked about finding a pharmacy for their baby's medicine, Bob said we could look for one tomorrow. As we got back on the road, I noticed that we weren't heading as far south as I'd expected. According to my grandfather's compass, we were traveling more southwest than due south. When I mentioned this to Bob at our next stop, he said we needed to avoid the areas where the highways were most congested. He said he knew a place where we could stay for a few days and wait for the traffic to clear up before continuing south. But he was vague about exactly where this place was or how long we'd be staying there. The temperature kept dropping as we drove, and the snow was getting heavier. By evening, it was down to 24 degrees, and the snow was coming down so thick that I had to drive with my headlights on, even though it wasn't dark yet. Maria was shivering constantly now, and her cough was getting deeper. She kept saying she was fine, just tired, but I could see that she was getting sicker. I started thinking about what my grandfather had written in his journal about how small problems become big problems when you're fighting for survival. We stopped for the night at an abandoned truck stop near the Indiana border. Bob said he'd stayed there before when he was driving long hauls, and he knew the owner wouldn't mind if we used the parking lot to sleep in our cars. But when we got there, the place was completely empty, and it looked like it had been closed for months. The windows were boarded up, and there was no sign of the owner Bob had mentioned. It felt like we were camping in a graveyard. That night, sleeping in our car in the parking lot of that abandoned truck stop, I listened to Maria's cough getting worse and thought about the route we'd been taking. According to my grandfather's compass, we'd been traveling southwest for most of the day, not south. If we kept going in this direction, we'd end up in Illinois or Missouri, not the southeastern states where the government was setting up emergency shelters. When I mentioned this to Bob the next morning, he said we needed to make a detour to avoid some trouble he'd heard about on the radio. The 8th day of our journey started with the Johnson family's car finally giving up completely. The engine seized up about an hour after we left the truck stop, and they were stranded on the side of a rural road in the middle of nowhere. Bob said we didn't have room in our cars to take all 4 of them, so we'd have to leave the parents behind and just take the kids. When I said we couldn't abandon the parents, Bob got angry and said we had to make hard choices if we wanted to survive. That's when I decided to use my factory mechanical skills to try to fix their car instead of leaving them behind. I'd been working on engines for years, and I knew that a seized engine could sometimes be saved if you caught it early enough. Bob kept saying we didn't have time for repairs, but I ignored him and started working on the Johnson's car. It took me 3 hours, but I managed to get it running again by replacing a broken water pump with parts I salvaged from an abandoned car we found nearby. While I was working on the car, I noticed that Bob was getting increasingly agitated. He kept checking his radio and looking at his watch like we were falling behind some kind of schedule. When I asked him what the rush was, he said there were reports of dangerous weather moving in, and we needed to reach shelter before it hit. But when I looked at the sky, it didn't look any worse than it had been for the past week. The ash was still falling, and the temperature was still dropping, but there was no sign of an approaching storm. That afternoon, we reached a small town in Indiana where Bob said we could get supplies and fuel. But when we got there, the town was almost completely empty. Most of the businesses were closed, and the few people we saw were either boarding up their windows or loading their cars to leave. The gas station was still open, but the owner said he was closing that evening and evacuating south. He warned us that there were reports of dangerous groups operating in the area, people who were robbing evacuees and taking their supplies. While we were in that town, I overheard Bob talking to someone on his radio again. This time I was close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. The person on the other end was asking about our progress and whether we were still on schedule to reach something called the compound. Bob assured him that we were making good time, despite some mechanical problems, and that we should arrive sometime the next day. When Bob saw that I was listening, he quickly ended the conversation and put the radio away. That night, we camped in a parking lot behind a closed restaurant. The Kowalski baby was crying constantly because she was cold, and Mrs. Garcia was complaining about the pain in her arthritic hands. Maria's cough was getting worse, and she was running a low fever. I was starting to think that we needed to find medical help soon, but Bob kept saying we just had to hold on for one more day until we reached our destination. I couldn't sleep that night, so I got out of the car and walked around the parking lot, trying to figure out where we were and where we were going. Using my grandfather's compass and the road signs I'd seen, I calculated that we were about 200 miles southwest of Detroit. If we'd been heading due south, we should have been in Kentucky by now. Instead, we were somewhere in central Indiana, and Bob was talking about reaching a compound that he'd never mentioned before. The 9th day started with Bob announcing that we were only a few hours away from our destination. He said it was a safe place where we could rest and regroup before continuing our journey south. But when I asked him for more details about this place, he was evasive. He said it was run by his brother, who had been preparing for emergencies like this for years. He said there would be food, shelter, and medical supplies for everyone. But he wouldn't tell me exactly where it was or how long we'd be staying there. As we drove that morning, I noticed that we were traveling on increasingly remote roads. We hadn't seen another car or person for hours, and the landscape was becoming more rural and isolated. The snow was getting deeper, and the temperature was down to 20 degrees. Maria was getting weaker, and I was starting to panic about what would happen if we didn't find help soon. Around noon, we reached a checkpoint where the road was blocked by several armed men in military-style clothing. Bob got out of his truck and talked to them for a few minutes, then came back and told us everything was fine. He said these were security guards for the compound, and they were just checking to make sure we weren't bringing any weapons or dangerous people. But I noticed that Bob seemed to know these men, and they seemed to be expecting us. The compound turned out to be a collection of buildings surrounded by a high fence, located in a remote valley about 10 miles from the main road. There were guard towers at the corners of the fence, and more armed men patrolling the perimeter. It looked more like a prison than a refugee center. When I asked Bob about the security measures, he said they were necessary to keep out dangerous people who might want to steal their supplies. As we drove through the gates, I saw that there were dozens of other families already there, living in temporary shelters and campers. But something about their body language made me uncomfortable. They looked scared and defeated, like prisoners, rather than guests. When I tried to talk to some of them, they were reluctant to answer my questions. They just said they were grateful for the shelter and food, and that Bob's brother was taking good care of them. Bob's brother turned out to be a man named Rick, who looked and acted like a military commander. He welcomed us to the compound and gave us a tour of the facilities. There was a dining hall, sleeping quarters, medical facilities, and workshops where people could work to earn their keep. But when I asked about when we'd be continuing our journey south, Rick said that might not be necessary. He said the compound was designed to be self-sufficient, and we could stay there indefinitely if we wanted to. That evening, at dinner in the communal dining hall, I started talking to some of the other families about their experiences. Most of them had been brought there by Bob or other guides who claimed to be leading them to safety. But none of them had been allowed to leave since they'd arrived. When they asked about continuing their journey south, they were told that it was too dangerous outside the compound. They were told that this was the safest place they could be. I was starting to realize that Bob had never intended to take us south to the government emergency shelters. He'd been recruiting people for his brother's compound, bringing them here under false pretenses. The other families were essentially prisoners, kept there by fear and dependence on Rick's supplies. The armed guards weren't there to keep dangerous people out. They were there to keep us in. That night, sleeping in the barrack-style sleeping quarters they'd assigned us, I listened to Maria's labored breathing and thought about how we'd been deceived. Bob had seemed like our salvation when we were desperate to escape Detroit, but he'd actually been leading us into a trap. The confidence that had made him seem trustworthy was actually the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. He was a recruiter, not a rescuer. The 10th day at the compound started with Rick explaining the rules and expectations for residents. Everyone was expected to work in the workshops or kitchen to earn their keep. Children would be educated in the compound school. Medical care would be provided by the compound's doctor. Everything we needed would be supplied, but we weren't allowed to leave the compound without permission. When I asked what would happen if someone wanted to leave, Rick said that wouldn't be wise given the dangerous conditions outside. I spent that day walking around the compound, trying to understand the layout and looking for ways to escape. The fence was 12 feet high and topped with razor wire. There were guard towers with armed men who watched everyone constantly. The only way in or out was through the main gate, which was heavily guarded. It was clear that Rick had designed this place to keep people in, not to keep danger out. During lunch, I sat with a family who'd been at the compound for 3 weeks. They told me they'd originally been trying to reach relatives in Florida, but their guide had brought them here instead. They'd asked about leaving several times, but Rick always found reasons why it wasn't safe. There were reports of roving gangs, he said, or severe weather, or government checkpoints that were turning people away. Always some new excuse for why they had to stay. That afternoon, I overheard a conversation between Rick and one of his guards about bringing in more families. They were talking about how Bob and other recruiters were out there right now, finding desperate people and promising to lead them to safety. It was a systematic operation designed to populate the compound with people who would be grateful enough to work and scared enough to stay. We weren't refugees being helped. We were resources being harvested. I knew we had to escape, but I also knew that Maria was getting sicker. Her fever was higher and her cough was producing blood. The compound's doctor said she had pneumonia and needed rest and medication. He said traveling in her condition would be dangerous, possibly fatal. I was trapped between wanting to get us out of there and being afraid that leaving might kill her. That evening, I told Maria about my concerns about the compound and Rick's real intentions. She said she'd been thinking the same thing, and she was worried about what would happen to us if we stayed. But she also admitted that she didn't think she was strong enough to travel right now. She asked me to give her a few more days to get stronger, and then we could try to leave together. But I could see that she was getting weaker, not stronger. The compound's doctor was giving her antibiotics, but they didn't seem to be helping much. I was starting to think that we might never get the chance to leave if we waited much longer. The other families had been waiting for weeks, and they were no closer to leaving than they'd been when they arrived. The 11th day brought a new group of families to the compound, led by another guide who worked with Bob. Watching them arrive, I could see the same mixture of hope and exhaustion that we'd felt when we got there. They were grateful for the shelter and food, and they trusted the guides who'd brought them there. They had no idea that they were walking into a trap. I tried to warn some of the newcomers about the true nature of the compound, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was just being paranoid or ungrateful. One man said he'd rather be safe behind the fence than taking his chances on the road. A woman said she was just grateful to have a warm place to sleep and food for her children. They couldn't see what I could see, that the compound was designed to make people dependent and compliant. That afternoon, I made a decision that I knew was risky but necessary. I told Maria that we were going to leave the compound that night, whether she felt ready or not. I couldn't stand the thought of staying there any longer, watching her get sicker while Rick and his men controlled every aspect of our lives. I'd rather take our chances on the road than become permanent residents of what was essentially a prison. Maria agreed, even though she was scared about traveling in her condition. She said she'd rather die free than live as a prisoner. We spent the rest of the day quietly preparing for our escape. I studied the guard rotation and identified the best time to make our move. I gathered our supplies and made sure my grandfather's compass was working properly. Most importantly, I convinced myself that we could make it to safety on our own. That night, we waited until the guards changed shifts at 2 o'clock in the morning. During the 15-minute gap when the new guards were getting settled in their positions, we slipped out of the sleeping quarters and made our way to a section of fence that was partially hidden by some storage buildings. I'd noticed earlier that there was a spot where the ground had eroded slightly, creating a small gap under the fence. It took us 20 minutes to crawl under the fence and make our way to the tree line beyond the compound. Maria was exhausted from the effort, and her cough was getting worse. But we were free, and we had my grandfather's compass to guide us. I knew that heading due south would eventually lead us to safety, even if we had to walk the entire way. As we walked through the dark forest, with Maria leaning on me for support, and the temperature dropping toward 15 degrees, I thought about how we'd been deceived by Bob and his promises of safe passage. He'd seemed like our salvation when we were desperate, but he'd actually been leading us into captivity. The lesson I was learning was that in desperate times, the people who seem most confident and helpful might be the ones you should trust the least. We walked for 3 hours before we reached a small road that led away from the compound. According to my grandfather's compass, the road ran east and west, and we needed to head south. But Maria was getting weaker, and she needed to rest. We found an abandoned farmhouse about a mile down the road, and I decided we'd shelter there for the remainder of the night. It wasn't much, but it was better than being trapped in Rick's compound. As I helped Maria settle into the farmhouse and tried to get a fire started in the old wood stove, I realized that our real journey was just beginning. We'd escaped from one trap, but we were still hundreds of miles from safety. Maria was sick, the weather was getting worse, and we had limited supplies. But we were free to make our own choices about where to go and what risks to take. For the first time in days, I felt like we had a chance. The abandoned farmhouse where we took shelter that first night after escaping the compound felt like a palace compared to the barracks where Rick had been keeping us. It was a simple two-story house with peeling paint and broken windows, but it had a wood-burning stove and a pile of seasoned firewood stacked against one wall. As I got the fire going and helped Maria settle onto an old couch I'd dragged near the stove, I couldn't help but notice how well stocked the place was with basic supplies. There were canned goods in the pantry, blankets in the closets, and even some basic medical supplies in the bathroom cabinet. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized the farmhouse had been prepared as some kind of way station. The supplies were too organized, too deliberately placed to be leftovers from the original owners. Someone had been using this place as a stopover point, and from the radio equipment I found in the basement, I suspected it might be connected to Rick's operation. The discovery made me nervous about staying there, but Maria's fever had gotten worse during the night, and she needed rest more than she needed to keep moving. Maria's pneumonia was progressing faster than I'd hoped. The antibiotics from the compound doctor weren't helping, and she was having trouble breathing. Her cough was producing more blood, and she was so weak that she could barely stand without help. I knew that moving her in this condition was dangerous, but I also knew that staying in one place too long was dangerous for different reasons. If the farmhouse really was connected to Rick's network, they might come looking for us. On our second day in the farmhouse, I spent hours going through my grandfather's journal, looking for any advice about treating respiratory illness in survival situations. He'd written about keeping patients warm and hydrated, about using steam to help with breathing, and about the importance of not moving sick people unless absolutely necessary. But he'd also written about the danger of staying in one place too long when you're being hunted. I was caught between two pieces of advice that contradicted each other. That afternoon, I saw the first sign that we weren't alone in the area. Through the farmhouse window, I spotted 3 men in military-style clothing walking along the tree line about half a mile away. They were moving in a search pattern, checking abandoned buildings and looking for signs of recent habitation. I was pretty sure they were from Rick's compound, looking for escaped residents. Maria was sleeping, and I didn't want to wake her, but I knew we'd have to be ready to move quickly if they found us. The men spent about an hour searching the area around the farmhouse, but they never came close enough to spot the smoke from our chimney or notice that someone was inside. After they left, I realized that we'd been incredibly lucky. If they'd been more thorough, or if they'd had dogs with them, they would have found us easily. It was clear that Rick wasn't going to just let people escape from his compound without trying to bring them back. That evening, while Maria slept fitfully by the fire, I used the radio equipment in the basement to try to get information about what was happening in the outside world. Most of the emergency broadcasts were still talking about the volcanic eruption and the need for people to evacuate south to warmer regions. But I also picked up some disturbing reports about armed groups operating in rural areas, taking advantage of the chaos to rob and kidnap evacuees. It seemed like the breakdown of normal society was happening faster than anyone had expected. One broadcast that particularly worried me was a report about government checkpoints being set up along major roads leading south. According to the report, federal authorities were screening evacuees and turning away anyone who couldn't prove they had family or sponsors in the southern states. The official reason was to prevent overcrowding in the emergency shelters, but it sounded like they were basically trapping people in the disaster zone if they didn't have the right connections. On our third day in the farmhouse, Maria seemed a little stronger. Her fever had broken during the night, and she was able to sit up and eat some soup I'd made from canned vegetables. But when I suggested that we should think about moving on, she admitted that she wasn't sure she could walk very far. The pneumonia had left her weak and short of breath, and she was worried about slowing me down if we had to travel on foot. I spent that day studying my grandfather's maps and trying to plan a route that would get us to safety without using the major roads where government checkpoints might be operating. According to the maps, there were dozens of small roads and farm lanes that ran generally southward through Indiana and into Kentucky. If we could follow those back roads, we might be able to avoid both the government checkpoints and the armed groups that were reportedly operating near the highways. But I was also starting to realize that we couldn't make the journey alone. Maria was too sick to walk long distances, and I didn't have enough medical knowledge to help her if she got worse. We needed to find other people who could help us, people we could trust. The problem was figuring out how to tell the difference between genuine refugees and people like Bob who were working for operations like Rick's compound. That afternoon, I heard vehicles approaching the farmhouse. Through the window, I could see a convoy of 3 cars coming up the long driveway. For a moment, I thought it might be Rick's men coming to take us back to the compound. But as the cars got closer, I could see that they were civilian vehicles loaded down with supplies, and the people inside looked like families rather than armed guards. The convoy was led by a middle-aged woman named Sarah who introduced herself as a former teacher from a town about 50 miles north of where we were. She and the 12 other people with her had been traveling together for almost a week, trying to reach relatives in Tennessee. They'd heard about the farmhouse from other refugees and were hoping to spend the night there before continuing south. When I told them about Maria's illness, Sarah immediately offered to help. Sarah turned out to have more medical training than I'd realized. She'd been a high school biology teacher, but she'd also worked as a volunteer EMT for several years. She took one look at Maria and said that she needed proper antibiotics and possibly oxygen therapy, the kind of treatment that wasn't available in an abandoned farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. Sarah said there was a small hospital in a town about 20 miles south that might still be operating. But Sarah also confirmed my suspicions about the farmhouse being connected to Rick's operation. She said they'd encountered several other families who'd been recruited by guides promising safe passage south, only to be taken to compounds or work camps instead. The whole region was apparently full of these operations, taking advantage of desperate people who had no choice but to trust strangers. Sarah said the key was to never travel with anyone who wouldn't tell you exactly where you were going and why. That evening, sitting around the fire in the farmhouse with Sarah's group, I learned more about what's happening in the outside world. The volcanic ash was continuing to block sunlight across most of North America, and temperatures were dropping even faster than scientists had predicted. The government emergency shelters in the South were already overcrowded, and many were turning away new arrivals. Some southern states were even talking about closing their borders to refugees from the North. Sarah's group had a battery-powered radio that could pick up more stations than the equipment in the farmhouse basement. We spent hours listening to reports from across the country, and none of it was encouraging. Food shortages were becoming critical in many areas. Power grids were failing as ash accumulated on transmission lines. Transportation networks were breaking down as vehicles couldn't operate in the increasingly harsh conditions. It was starting to sound like the collapse of civilization was accelerating. But the most disturbing reports were about the armed groups that were taking control of rural areas. These weren't just random bandits robbing travelers. They were organized militias that were setting up their own territories and capturing people to use as forced labor. Some reports suggested that these groups were coordinating with each other, dividing up regions and sharing resources. The compound where Rick had been holding us was apparently just one small part of a much larger network. On our 4th day in the farmhouse, Sarah convinced me that we needed to take Maria to the hospital she'd mentioned, even though it meant exposing ourselves to more risk. Maria's breathing was getting worse again, and Sarah thought she might be developing complications from the pneumonia. If we waited much longer, Sarah said, Maria might not survive the journey south, even if we found a safe route. The decision to leave the farmhouse and travel with Sarah's group was one of the hardest I'd made since leaving Detroit. Part of me wanted to stay hidden until Maria got stronger, but I was starting to realize that she wasn't going to get better without proper medical care. And part of me was still suspicious of trusting our safety to people we'd just met. But Sarah and her group seemed genuine, and they had skills and resources that we needed. Before we left the farmhouse, I made sure to destroy any evidence that we'd been there. I scattered the ashes from the fireplace, cleaned up our food containers, and even wiped down surfaces where we might have left fingerprints. If Rick's men came looking for us, I wanted to make sure they couldn't tell which direction we'd gone or how long we'd been there. My grandfather had written about the importance of covering your tracks when you're being hunted, and I was starting to understand what he meant. The journey to the hospital took us through some of the most desolate landscape I'd ever seen. The ash had killed most of the vegetation, and the snow was so deep that we could barely see the tops of fence posts. Abandoned cars lined the roads, some with their doors open, like the occupants had just walked away. We passed several houses that had collapsed under the weight of the accumulated ash and snow, and I found myself wondering what had happened to the families who'd lived there. Sarah's group traveled in a tight convoy, with the cars staying close together and maintaining radio contact. She'd learned from experience that spreading out made you vulnerable to ambush, and that losing contact with other vehicles could be fatal in these conditions. I was impressed by how organized they were, and how they'd developed systems for dealing with problems like vehicle breakdowns or medical emergencies. It was clear that they'd learned these lessons the hard way. About halfway to the hospital, we encountered our first government checkpoint. It was set up at a bridge crossing over a small river, with military vehicles blocking the road and soldiers checking the documents of everyone trying to pass. Sarah had warned us about this checkpoint, but she said it was the only way to reach the hospital without making a detour that would add hours to our journey. The soldiers at the checkpoint were polite but thorough. They checked our identification, asked about our destination, and wanted to know if we had family or sponsors waiting for us in the South. When I explained that we were trying to reach emergency shelters, the sergeant in charge looked skeptical. He said the shelters were full, and they were only letting people through who had confirmed places to stay. I was starting to panic when Sarah stepped in and said she had a cousin in Tennessee who was expecting all of us. I don't know if the sergeant believed Sarah's story, but he let us pass after making us sign some paperwork acknowledging that we were traveling at our own risk. As we drove away from the checkpoint, Sarah explained that she'd been lying about the cousin in Tennessee. She said that checkpoint soldiers were under orders to turn back anyone who didn't have specific destinations, so she'd learned to always have a story ready. The goal was just to get through the checkpoint, not to actually go where you said you were going. The hospital turned out to be a small rural facility that was barely functioning. Most of the staff had evacuated south, and the remaining doctors and nurses were overwhelmed with refugees who needed medical care. The emergency room was full of people with respiratory problems from breathing ash, injuries from vehicle accidents, and various illnesses that had developed during their journeys. It was like a battlefield hospital, with medical staff making life and death decisions about who could be helped and who couldn't. Maria was lucky enough to be seen by a doctor who confirmed that she had developed pneumonia with complications. He said she needed intravenous antibiotics and at least a week of rest in a warm, clean environment. But the hospital didn't have beds available for long-term care, and the doctor said she'd have to continue her journey as soon as her condition stabilized. He gave her a stronger antibiotic injection and some medications to take with us, but he warned that she needed to avoid strenuous activity for at least another week. While Maria was being treated, I spent time talking to other refugees in the hospital waiting room. Their stories were remarkably similar to ours. Most had been deceived by guides who promised to take them to safety but had other plans. Some had escaped from compounds like Rick's, while others had been robbed by armed groups along the roads. A few had made it through government checkpoints only to be turned away from emergency shelters that were already full. One family I talked to had been traveling for 2 weeks and had covered less than 200 miles. They'd been forced to take detours to avoid dangerous areas, had lost most of their supplies to bandits, and had spent days hiding in abandoned buildings. The father told me that the journey south was becoming more dangerous every day, as desperate people became more willing to take what they needed from other travelers. He said the key to survival was staying with a group large enough to defend itself, but small enough to move quickly. That evening, while Maria rested in the hospital, Sarah and I sat in her car and planned our next moves. She said her group was planning to continue south the next morning, trying to reach the Tennessee border before the weather got worse. She invited us to come with them, but she was honest about the risks. The roads ahead were reportedly full of checkpoints, armed groups, and other dangers. And Maria's condition meant that we might slow down the whole group if she had another medical crisis. I was torn between wanting the safety of traveling with Sarah's group and worrying about putting them at risk because of Maria's illness. But Sarah made the decision easier by pointing out that we'd all be stronger if we stuck together. She said that my mechanical skills had already proved valuable when we'd had to repair one of their cars, and that Maria's teaching experience might be useful if we encountered families with children. We weren't just passengers asking for help. We were potential contributors to the group's survival. That night, sleeping in chairs in the hospital waiting room, I thought about how much our situation had changed since we'd escaped from Rick's compound. We'd gone from being prisoners to being part of a group of people who were genuinely trying to help each other survive. But I was also aware that we were still hundreds of miles from safety, and that the journey ahead was going to test all of us in ways we couldn't imagine. The next morning, Maria felt strong enough to travel, and we left the hospital with Sarah's group. As we drove away from the small town and headed deeper into rural Kentucky, I looked back at the hospital and wondered if we'd made the right choice. Maria was still weak, the weather was getting worse, and we were heading into territory that none of us knew well. But we were together, and we had a plan. And for the first time since leaving Detroit, I felt like we might actually have a chance of reaching safety. The road ahead wound through hills covered in ash and snow, disappearing into a gray landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. According to Sarah's maps, we were still more than 300 miles from the Tennessee border, and every mile was going to be a struggle. But as I drove through that desolate landscape with Maria sleeping in the passenger seat and Sarah's convoy ahead of us, I realized that we'd already survived more than I'd thought possible when we first left Detroit. Whatever lay ahead, we'd face it together. The journey with Sarah's group through rural Kentucky started out hopeful, but by our second day together, I was beginning to notice things that made me uncomfortable. Sarah was an excellent leader and organizer, but there was something about Danny, one of the men in her group, that didn't sit right with me. He was always volunteering to scout ahead or check our rear, and he spent a lot of time away from the main group with his own radio. When I asked Sarah about him, she said he'd joined them just a few days before they found us at the farmhouse. Danny claimed to be a former security guard from Indianapolis who'd lost his family in the early days of the disaster. His story seemed plausible enough, and he definitely had useful skills for keeping our group safe. But I noticed that he asked a lot of questions about where we'd come from and where we were planning to go. Questions that seemed more detailed than casual conversation required. My grandfather had written in his journal about trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, and my instincts were telling me to watch Danny carefully. Maria was doing better with the antibiotics from the hospital, but she was still weak and needed frequent rest stops. The pneumonia had left her with very little stamina, and the cold air made her cough worse. Sarah had been incredibly patient about adjusting our travel schedule to accommodate Maria's needs. But I could see that some of the other group members were getting frustrated with our slow pace. We were covering maybe 50 miles a day when we should have been doing twice that. On our third day traveling together, we encountered our first real crisis. We'd stopped for lunch at an abandoned gas station when Danny came running back from his scouting position up the road. He said there was an armed roadblock about 2 miles ahead, with men demanding payment from anyone trying to pass. According to Danny, they had automatic weapons and looked professional, not like random bandits. He said we'd need to find an alternate route or risk being robbed or worse. Sarah immediately started studying her maps to find a detour around the roadblock, but the alternate routes would add hours to our journey and take us through terrain that might be impassable for our vehicles. While we were discussing our options, I noticed that Danny was on his radio again, talking quietly to someone. When I asked him about it, he said he was trying to get more information about the roadblock from other travelers in the area. We ended up taking a detour that led us through back roads I wouldn't have attempted in good weather, much less in these conditions. The roads were barely wide enough for our cars, and they were covered with ice that made driving treacherous. But Sarah was determined to avoid the armed roadblock, and Danny kept insisting that it was our only safe option. It took us 6 hours to cover what should have been a 2-hour drive, and by the time we rejoined the main road, it was getting dark. That evening, we sheltered in an abandoned school building that Sarah had identified on her maps. It was a large brick structure that seemed solid enough to provide protection from the weather and any potential threats. The classrooms were empty and cold, but we were able to get some portable heaters running and create a relatively comfortable space for everyone to rest. Maria was exhausted from the long day of travel, and her cough was getting worse again. While Maria slept, I spent time talking to the other families in Sarah's group. There was the Morrison family with 2 teenage daughters, the elderly Patels who'd been visiting their son in Michigan when the disaster started, and the Johansson family with a baby who was about the same age as the Kowalski baby had been back. At Rick's compound, all of them had stories similar to ours about being deceived by guides or encountering dangerous groups along their journey south. But what bothered me was that several of them mentioned Danny as the person who'd suggested joining Sarah's group. He'd apparently approached them at different times and places, always with helpful advice about safe routes or places to find supplies. When I asked Sarah about this, she seemed surprised. She said she'd thought Danny had been with her group longer than that, and she hadn't realized he'd been recruiting other families to join them. That night, I couldn't sleep because of what I'd learned about Danny. The pattern was too familiar from our experience with Bob and Rick's compound. Someone approaches disparate families with helpful advice and gradually guides them toward a predetermined destination. The fact that Danny always volunteered for scouting duties meant he had plenty of opportunities to communicate with outside parties without being observed by the rest of us. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I got up to check on Maria and noticed that Danny wasn't in the classroom where he was supposed to be sleeping. I looked around the school building and found him in a side room, talking quietly on his radio. I could only hear part of the conversation, but he was definitely giving someone updates on our location and the number of people in our group. When he saw me listening, he quickly ended the call and claimed he was just checking weather reports. The next morning, our 4th day traveling with Sarah's group, I made a decision that probably saved all our lives. Instead of confronting Danny directly or telling Sarah about my suspicions, I quietly suggested that we should change our planned route. I told Sarah I'd been studying my grandfather's maps and had found what looked like a better way to reach the Tennessee border. It would take us southeast instead of due south, but it would avoid some areas where we'd heard reports of dangerous activity. Sarah was open to the suggestion, but Danny immediately objected. He said the route I was proposing would take us through territory he'd heard was controlled by hostile groups. He insisted that we should stick to the original plan. which would take us through a town called Morganfield, where he said there were supplies available. Something about his insistence made me even more suspicious, and I noticed that he seemed unusually invested in our destination for someone who was supposedly just along for the ride. We compromised by agreeing to head toward Morganfield, but with the understanding that we'd reassess our route once we got there. But as we were loading our cars that morning, I noticed Danny talking on his radio again. This time I was close enough to hear him giving specific details about our planned arrival time en route. That's when I knew for certain that he was working with someone else, probably leading us into the same kind of trap that Bob had led us into at Rick's compound. I made a split-second decision that felt crazy at the time, but turned out to be crucial. As our convoy was getting ready to leave the school, I told Sarah that Maria was feeling sick again and needed to rest for another hour. It was a lie, but it bought me time to sabotage Danny's car by disconnecting his battery cables and loosening his fan belt. I knew it would only delay him temporarily, but I hoped it would give us enough time to get away. When Danny's car wouldn't start, he seemed genuinely surprised and frustrated. Sarah offered to give him a ride in her car, but I suggested that maybe we should split up temporarily for safety reasons. I said Maria and I would take a different route to the rendezvous point and we'd meet up with the group later. Sarah was reluctant to divide the group, but she understood that Maria's health needs sometimes required flexibility in our travel plans. As Maria and I drove away from the school, heading in a different direction from Sarah's group, I watched in my rearview mirror as Danny worked frantically to get his car started. I felt guilty about abandoning Sarah and the others, but I was convinced that staying with the group would have led us all into danger. My grandfather had written about the importance of making hard decisions quickly when you're in a survival situation, and I was hoping this was one of those times when trusting my instincts would prove to be right. We'd been driving for about an hour when I heard gunfire coming from the direction Sarah's group had taken. It was distant, but unmistakable, the rapid fire of automatic weapons that lasted for several minutes before stopping abruptly. I wanted to turn around and try to help them, but I knew that Maria and I wouldn't be able to make any difference against armed attackers. All I could do was hope that some of them had managed to escape, and that my decision to leave the group hadn't been completely selfish. Using my grandfather's compass and the back road maps he'd marked, I navigated us toward what I hoped would be a safer route south. The roads were in terrible condition, barely passable in some places, but at least we weren't driving into an ambush. Maria was concerned about abandoning Sarah's group, but she trusted my judgment enough not to question my decision. She could see that I was shaken by what had happened, and she focused on navigating and watching for dangers ahead. By late afternoon, we came across an abandoned elementary school that looked like it might provide shelter for the night. It was a single-story brick building set back from the road, partially hidden by trees and already covered with enough ash and snow that it blended into the landscape. As we approached the building, I noticed that there were tracks in the snow, leading to one of the side entrances. Fresh tracks made within the last day or two. I told Maria to stay in the car while I investigated the building. Using skills I'd learned from years of troubleshooting machinery at the Ford plant, I approached the school carefully and quietly, trying to figure out who might be inside without exposing myself to danger. What I found was better than I dared to hope. The tracks belonged to other refugees, a small group of families who'd been using the school as a temporary shelter. The group was led by a woman named Claire, who turned out to be a former teacher at the school where we'd taken shelter. She'd returned to her old workplace when her own home became uninhabitable, and she'd been helping other travelers who needed a safe place to rest. There were 8 people in total, including 2 families with young children and an elderly couple who reminded me of the Patels from Sarah's group. Claire immediately offered to help when she saw Maria's condition. Unlike Danny, who'd always asked probing questions about our background and destination, Claire was focused on practical matters like making sure Maria stayed warm and had enough to eat. She'd organized the school's cafeteria into a functioning kitchen and had managed to maintain heat in several classrooms using portable heaters and improvised insulation. That evening, sitting in what had once been a kindergarten classroom, surrounded by children's artwork that was still hanging on the walls, I told Claire about our experiences with Bob's deception, Rick's compound, and my suspicions about Danny. She wasn't surprised by any of it. She said the region was full of people taking advantage of the refugee crisis, and that learning to identify genuine helpers from predators was becoming a critical survival skill. Claire had been keeping track of other refugee groups passing through the area, and she'd heard similar stories about guides who led people into traps. But she'd also heard about successful journeys and safe destinations, which gave me hope that Maria and I might eventually reach safety. According to Claire, the key was traveling with small groups of people you could trust completely, rather than larger groups where infiltrators could hide their true intentions. The next morning, our 5th day since leaving the hospital, Claire offered to let us stay at the school for as long as we needed. She said Maria clearly needed more time to recover, and she thought it was safer for everyone to wait until the worst of the winter weather passed before continuing south. But I was worried about staying in one place too long, especially after what had happened to Sarah's group. If Danny had survived the ambush, and if he really was working with a larger network, he might eventually track us to the school. I spent that day working with Claire and the other refugees to improve the school's defenses and communication capabilities. We moved furniture to block some entrances, set up lookout posts at windows with good views of the surrounding area, and organized a system for taking turns on guard duty. I also used my mechanical skills to get an old radio working, which allowed us to monitor emergency broadcasts and try to establish contact with other survivor groups. That afternoon, we made contact with a FEMA station broadcasting from somewhere in southern Kentucky. The operator confirmed that there were still emergency shelters operating near the Tennessee border, but they were severely overcrowded and had limited medical facilities. He also warned us about increased activity from armed groups in our area, and advised us to avoid main roads and travel only in daylight. Most importantly, he gave us radio frequencies where we could call for help if we encountered serious trouble. The radio contact was encouraging, but it also made me realize how far we still were from safety. According to the FEMA operator, we were at least 200 miles from the nearest emergency shelter, and the route would take us through some of the most dangerous territory in the region. With Maria still recovering from pneumonia and winter weather getting worse every day, the journey was going to test us in ways I wasn't sure we were prepared for. That night, as I listened to Maria's breathing gradually becoming stronger and more regular, I thought about the choices we'd made since leaving Detroit 16 days earlier. We'd been deceived, trapped, and threatened, but we'd also found genuine help from people like Sarah and Claire. The key seemed to be learning to tell the difference between people who wanted to help us reach our own goals and people who wanted to use us to achieve theirs. Looking ahead to the journey that still waited for us, I knew that the real test was just beginning. We'd learned valuable lessons about survival and trust, but we were about to enter the most dangerous part of our escape from the Ice Age. That was consuming everything we'd ever known. The next few days would determine whether we'd make it to safety or become another casualty of the disaster that had already claimed so many lives. After 3 days of rest at Claire's school, Maria was finally strong enough for us to continue our journey south. Her breathing had improved dramatically, and the antibiotics from the hospital had cleared up most of the pneumonia symptoms. But I could tell she was nervous about leaving the safety of the school, and honestly, so was I. Claire had become like family to us, and the other refugees there had created a sense of community that reminded me of the good parts of our old neighborhood in Detroit. Claire helped us plan our route to the Tennessee border, using local knowledge that proved invaluable. She'd grown up in the area and knew back roads that weren't marked on any of my grandfather's maps. More importantly, She'd been in contact with other refugee groups and had current information about which routes were safe and which ones to avoid. According to her sources, the main highways were controlled by various armed groups, but there were still some back roads that were relatively clear. The plan was for Maria and I to travel with two other families from the school, the Hendersons and the Washingtons, who were also ready to continue their journey south. Both families had skills that would be useful on the road. Tom Henderson was a former mechanic who could help if we had car trouble, and Janet Washington was a nurse who could provide medical care if anyone got sick or injured. Together, we made a group of 8 people in 3 cars, which felt like a good size for safety without being too large to move quickly. On our 19th day since leaving Detroit, we said goodbye to Claire and the school that had become our sanctuary. As we loaded our cars with supplies that Claire had generously shared with us, I couldn't help but feel like we were leaving behind the last bit of normal civilization we might see for a long time. Claire had created something special at that school, a place where people helped each other without expecting anything in return. I hoped we'd find more places like that on our journey south. The first day of our renewed journey went better than I'd expected. We followed Claire's route through rural Kentucky, avoiding main roads and staying on farm lanes and county highways that were barely wide enough for our cars. The landscape was desolate, covered in ash and snow, but we didn't encounter any other travelers or signs of the armed groups that supposedly controlled the area. Maria was handling the travel well, and our small convoy was making good time toward the Tennessee border. But on our second day, we encountered our first serious obstacle. The back road we'd been following was blocked by a bridge that had collapsed under the weight of accumulated ash and snow. The river it had crossed was frozen solid, but the banks were too steep for our cars to navigate safely. Tom Henderson scouted the area and found an alternate crossing about 5 miles upstream, but getting there would require us to backtrack and take a route that would add hours to our journey. As we were discussing our options, Janet Washington spotted movement in the tree line on the far side of the river. Through binoculars, we could see at least 6 men in military-style clothing watching us from concealed positions. They weren't making any threatening moves, but they were clearly tracking our location and probably communicating with other groups in the area. Tom thought they might be scouts for one of the armed groups that controlled territory in this part of Kentucky. We decided to retreat and find the alternate crossing, but as we were loading back into our cars, I noticed that one of the vehicles in our convoy was having engine problems. The Washington's car was making strange noises and losing power, which meant we were going to be traveling slowly just when we needed to move fast. I used my factory mechanical skills to diagnose the problem, which turned out to be a failing alternator that was draining the battery. The alternator repair took me almost 3 hours, working in freezing temperatures while Janet and Maria kept watch for any signs that the armed men were moving closer to our position. Tom helped me with the repair, and together we managed to get the car running again using parts salvaged from an abandoned vehicle we found nearby. But I knew the repair was temporary, and we'd need to find better parts soon or risk being stranded. As we finally reached the alternate river crossing, the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping towards 0. The crossing turned out to be more difficult than Tom had anticipated. The ice was thick enough to support our weight, but the approach on both sides required careful maneuvering to avoid getting stuck in snowdrifts. It took us 2 hours to get all 3 cars across safely, and by the time we were on the other side, it was completely dark. We spent that night in an abandoned farmhouse about 10 miles from the river crossing. The house had been partially damaged by the weight of ash on the roof, but it was still weatherproof enough to provide shelter. More importantly, it was isolated enough that we could risk building a fire without attracting unwanted attention. Maria was exhausted from the long day, and I was worried that the stress of the difficult travel was affecting her recovery from pneumonia. That night, while the others slept, I spent time with my grandfather's journal and the radio equipment we'd brought from Claire's school. I was trying to get updated information about conditions ahead and hopefully make contact with the FEMA station we'd talked to before. What I learned was discouraging. The radio chatter suggested that the armed groups in the region were becoming more organized and more aggressive. They weren't just robbing travelers anymore. They were capturing people and forcing them to work in labor camps. The FEMA operator I'd talked to before confirmed my worst fears. Several refugee groups had disappeared in the area we were trying to cross, and there were reports of coordinated ambushes designed to capture intact families rather than just steal supplies. The operator said that federal authorities were aware of the situation, but didn't have resources to intervene. He advised us to avoid the area entirely and find a different route to Tennessee, even if it meant traveling hundreds of miles out of our way. But when I discussed this information with Tom and Janet the next morning, we realized that we didn't have enough fuel or supplies to make a major detour. We were committed to the route we'd started, and our only choice was to be extremely careful about how we proceeded. Tom suggested that we should split up and travel in single cars rather than as a convoy, which would make us less conspicuous, but also more vulnerable if we encountered trouble. On our 21st day since leaving Detroit, we made the decision. That would ultimately save our lives. Instead of continuing as a group, we decided to leapfrog our way south, with one car traveling ahead to scout the route while the others waited in concealed positions. If the scout car encountered trouble, they could radio back to warn the others. If they made it through safely, the next car would follow the same route an hour later. I volunteered to be the first scout, driving ahead with Maria while Tom and Janet waited with their families at the farmhouse. Using my grandfather's compass and the detailed maps that Claire had given us, I planned a route that would take us through the most remote areas possible, avoiding any towns or major road intersections where armed groups might be operating. The plan was to drive for 2 hours, then find a safe place to wait and radio back to the others. The scouting mission started out well. We followed dirt roads and farm lanes through countryside that seemed completely abandoned. Most of the farmhouses we passed were empty, and there were no signs of recent vehicle traffic in the snow. But about an hour into our journey, I started noticing things that made me nervous. There were too many abandoned vehicles along the roads, and they all seemed to be positioned in places where they would force other traffic to slow down or stop. When we reached a small town that was supposed to be on our route, I realized that we'd driven into a carefully planned trap. The main road through town was blocked by several abandoned cars, but the blockade was arranged in a way that funneled traffic toward a side street where armed men were waiting in concealed positions. I spotted the ambush just in time to reverse our car and retreat before they could react to our presence. As we drove away from the town as fast as our car could safely travel on the icy roads, I radioed back to Tom and Janet to warn them about the ambush. But when I tried to reach them, all I got was static. Either they were too far away to receive my transmission, or something was jamming our radio communications. I realized that the armed groups in the area were probably using more sophisticated equipment than I'd expected, and that our simple handheld radios might not be reliable. Maria and I spent the rest of that day finding an alternate route that would avoid the town where we'd encountered the ambush. Using my grandfather's compass and some educated guessing, I navigated us through back roads that weren't marked on any map. It was slow going, and several times we had to backtrack when roads turned out to be impassable. But eventually we found a route that seemed to lead in the right direction. That evening, we took shelter in an abandoned church about 20 miles south of where we'd left Tom and Janet. The church was a small building that was partially hidden by trees, and it had the advantage of being constructed from stone that wouldn't show heat signatures if anyone was using thermal imaging equipment to search for refugees. As we settled in for the night, I kept trying to radio contact with the others, but I never got any response. The next morning, I faced one of the hardest decisions of our entire journey. I wanted to go back and look for Tom, Janet, and their families, but I also knew that Maria and I might be walking into the same trap that had probably captured them. My grandfather had written about the importance of not letting emotions override good judgment in survival situations, and I knew that the smart thing to do was to continue south and hope that the others had found their own way to safety. But as we were preparing to leave the church, we heard vehicles approaching on the road outside. Through the windows, I could see a convoy of military-style trucks heading north, in the direction of where we'd left the other families. The trucks were loaded with armed men and equipment that looked too sophisticated for a local militia. This was clearly a well-organized operation with resources that came from somewhere other than just robbing travelers. After the convoy passed, Maria and I waited another hour before venturing back onto the road. We continued south using the route I'd mapped out the day before, but now I was constantly watching for signs of pursuit. The landscape we were traveling through was perfect for ambushes, with plenty of hills and trees that could conceal armed groups. Every abandoned car or building made me nervous, and I found myself checking my grandfather's compass obsessively to make sure we were still heading in the right direction. Around midday, we encountered something that gave me hope for the first time in days. We came across another refugee family, the Stevensons, who were traveling in a single car with their 3 children. They'd been on the road for almost a month, and they had recent information about conditions ahead. According to them, there was a functioning FEMA checkpoint about 50 miles south where federal authorities were actually providing protection for refugees. The Stevensons agreed to travel with us for safety, and their local knowledge proved invaluable. Mr. Stevenson had grown up in the area and knew shortcuts that would save us hours of driving. More importantly, he knew which areas were controlled by hostile groups and which routes were still relatively safe. With his guidance, we were able to avoid several potential ambush sites and make better time toward the Tennessee border. But our improved progress came at a cost. The Stevensons' car was in even worse condition than ours, and it was clear that it wouldn't last much longer. We spent several hours that afternoon making emergency repairs using my factory mechanical skills and parts scavenged from abandoned vehicles. The repairs would get us a few more miles down the road, but I knew we were going to need professional help soon or risk being stranded in hostile territory. That evening, we reached a crossroads where we had to make a crucial decision about our route. The direct path to the FEMA checkpoint would take us through territory that the Stevensons said was controlled by one of the most dangerous armed groups in the region. The alternate route would add 2 days to our journey and take us through areas where we might encounter severe weather. With both cars showing signs of mechanical stress and our fuel supplies running low, either choice carried significant risks. We decided to take the direct route, betting that speed was more important than avoiding danger. Using techniques I'd learned from my grandfather's journal, we planned our approach to minimize exposure to potential ambushes. We would travel only during daylight hours, maintain radio silence except for emergencies, and be prepared to abandon our vehicles and continue on foot if necessary. It was a desperate plan, but I felt like we were running out of better options. The next morning, our final day of travel, we started the most dangerous part of our entire journey. The road to the FEMA checkpoint took us through a valley that was perfect for ambushes, with steep hills on both sides and limited opportunities to turn around if we encountered trouble. But we also knew that federal authorities were actively patrolling the area around the checkpoint, which meant that any armed groups operating there would have to be more cautious. About halfway through the valley, we encountered our first checkpoint, but it turned out to be operated by actual federal soldiers rather than one of the armed groups we'd been avoiding. The soldiers were professional and courteous, checking our identification and asking basic questions about our journey. When they learned that Maria had been sick with pneumonia, they immediately offered medical assistance and called ahead to the main checkpoint to let them know we were coming. The soldiers also gave us disturbing news about what had happened to other refugee groups in the area. They confirmed that several organized armed groups were operating in the region, and that many refugees had been captured or killed while trying to reach safety. They said that federal authorities were working to clear out these groups, but it was a slow process because of limited resources and the difficult terrain. As we approached the main FEMA checkpoint, I could see dozens of other refugee families waiting in organized camps. There were medical tents, food distribution points, and temporary shelters that looked like they could actually provide the safety we'd been seeking for 3 weeks. Federal officials processed our paperwork and assigned us to a temporary housing unit where Maria could rest and receive proper medical care. That night, sleeping in a real bed for the first time since leaving Detroit, I reflected on the 21-day journey that had brought us to safety. We'd lost friends along the way, been deceived by people we trusted, and faced dangers that I'd never imagined when we first decided to leave our home. But we'd also discovered inner strength we didn't know we had. Learned to depend on each other in ways that made our relationship stronger, and found that there were still good people in the world who were willing to help strangers in need. The FEMA officials told us that the emergency shelter was just a temporary way station and that we'd eventually be relocated to more permanent housing in areas that were better equipped to handle large numbers of refugees. But for now, we were safe, warm, and fed. Maria's health was improving every day, and we had time to plan our next steps without the constant pressure of immediate survival. Looking back on our journey, I realized that the lessons my grandfather had tried to teach me about survival and leadership had been more valuable than I'd ever understood. His compass had literally saved our lives by keeping us oriented when we couldn't trust the people who claimed to be guiding us. His journal had provided practical advice that helped us make life and death decisions. But most importantly, his wisdom about trusting your instincts and taking care of the people you love had given me the courage to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. The ice age that had started with the Yellowstone eruption was far from over. According to the scientists at the FEMA checkpoint, temperatures would continue dropping for months or even years, and much of the northern United States would remain uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. The world we'd known was gone forever, and we have to build new lives in a very different environment. But Maria and I had survived the first 21 days of that new world, and we'd learned that we were stronger together than either of us could have been alone. We'd discovered that even in the worst circumstances, there are always choices to be made and always reasons to keep hoping. The dark clouds I could see gathering on the horizon suggested that our challenges were far from over, but I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it with the knowledge that we'd already survived more than we'd thought possible. The factory worker who'd left Detroit 3 weeks earlier had been transformed by the journey into someone who understood the difference between genuine help and manipulation, someone who could make hard decisions under pressure, and someone who'd learned that leadership isn't about being the strongest person in the group. It's about being willing to take responsibility for protecting the people who depend on you, even when you're not sure you know what you're doing.